On December the 18th, 1934, Richard John Bingham was born at 19 Bentinck Street in Marylebone, London, the second child of George Bingham, the 6th Earl of Lucan, and his wife, Caitlin Dawson. As a child, Caitlin developed a blood clot inside her lung which forced her to remain in a nursing home, leading to Richard, who would go by his middle name of John, being raised by the family's nursery maid. At the age of just 3, John attended a pre-prep school in Tite Street with his older sister Jane, but 2 years later, World War II began, leading to the two children being relocated to Wales for their own safety. The next year, the younger siblings Sally and Hugh would join them, and they would all move to Toronto, Ontario, Canada, before relocating again to Mount Kisco, New York. They remained there for around 5 years, with John enrolling at the Harvey School, spending summer holidays away from his siblings in a camp at the Adirondack Mountains. The children were spoiled during their time in the United States before returning to England in February of 1945, facing the harsh reality of the ongoing war in Britain. One of their old homes had been bombed, another had its window blown out, and rationing was extremely scarce. During this time, John began to suffer with nightmares and was even taken to a psychotherapist. As he grew into adulthood, despite being an agnostic, he still sent his children to Sunday school. John would attend Eton College, where he would develop a love for gambling. This led to his pocket money going to a secret bank account, and he would very often leave the college grounds to go and bet on horse races. His academic record was described as being far from creditable, but he soon became house captain before leaving in 1953 to join the army. He became a second lieutenant in his father's regiment and was stationed in West Germany, where he would become a frequent poker player. John left the army in 1954 and joined a London bank. 6 years on, and he would meet wealthy stockbroker Stephen Raphael, who was also a skilled card player. They spent a holiday together in the Bahamas, where John would become a regular gambler and was very good at it, though he did also have a bunch of losses as well. At one point, he lost £8,000, which was 2/3 of the money he received from his family trusts every year. Another night, he would lose £10,000, though his uncle helped him pay off the debt, and John would repay him 2 years later. He would even end up winning £26,000 before leaving the bank. He was angry and bitter at the job, as a colleague had been promoted before him, stating, "Why should I work in a bank when I can earn a year's money in one single night at the tables?" John travelled back to the United States for a bit before returning to England to get his own place in Park Crescent. He would then meet Veronica Duncan in 1963 at a golf club function, and they soon got engaged, even marrying the same year on November the 20th. Just 2 months later, on January the 21st, 1964, John's father George sadly passed away from a stroke. This led to his son getting even more money with a £250,000 inheritance, and John was now the Earl of Lucan and his wife the Countess. He claimed that he had a dream to have at least £2 million in the bank one day. John and Veronica had their first child, Frances, on October the 24th, 1964, and the next year they hired a nanny, Lillian Jenkins, to look after her. John did try to teach his wife about gambling, as well as numerous of his favourite sports, but she rarely picked up the same interest. John was gaining popularity and was even screen tested for a part in Woman x 7, and was considered for the part of iconic British movie spy James Bond. He would go on to win many gambling competitions, but would end up with more losses than wins, and not necessarily just within the gambling world. Veronica wasn't entirely knowledgeable of exactly how much John was losing. Though they would sometimes argue over money, she was always kept in the dark over a lot of it. They would go on to have 2 more children, George and Camilla, in 1967 and 1970 respectively, but Veronica would soon suffer from postnatal depression. John was a supportive husband and took her to a psychiatric clinic in Hampstead, but she refused to be treated. She instead agreed to home visits from a psychiatrist and for some antidepressants to be administered. Their marriage was falling apart due to her mental health as well as John's severe gambling addiction. They shared Christmas together in 1972, but after that, John moved out into his own place in Eaton Row. Veronica attempted to reconcile, but John made it clear that he just wasn't interested and only wanted custody of their children. He was determined to prove that she was unfit to take care of their kids, often spying on her, even hiring private investigators to watch her as well. Veronica had previously let the nanny go, and John twisted this to say that everyone refused to work for her. Veronica even later claimed that John would often physically assault her, and then they would make love almost immediately after, almost as if he got off on the abuse.
though she later claimed the marriage was filled with love and passion.
Though another nanny, Stefania Saurka, claimed that Veronica told her that John once hit her with a cane and even pushed her down the stairs at one point. She allegedly feared for her own safety and even told the nanny, "Don't be surprised if he kills me one day." One day, while Saurka was out with two of his children, John approached her and claimed that she has to hand the kids over to him in order of the court, which she did, and the other child was collected from school later that day. Veronica appealed for the children to be returned and a court hearing was set, but not for another 3 months. It was concluded that Veronica was struggling but wasn't mentally ill. She even booked herself a 4-day stay at a priory clinic in Roehampton to try to prove herself. John did his best to prove that she was an unfit mother, but he failed to defend himself and his own actions. So custody was awarded to Veronica instead, with John seeing his children every other weekend. This led to more resentment between them. John would continue to spy on his wife, even recording any phone conversation they had and showing them to his friends. He would deliberately stop giving her certain amounts of money, knowing that she would need it to hire a nanny or to take care of their children, leading to Veronica getting her own job in a hospital. Elizabeth Murphy was a temporary nanny and John befriended her, buying her drinks and trying to get as much information on his wife as possible. He then demanded his detective agency investigate Murphy to try to find any evidence that she was failing to properly take care of his children. All they managed to find were bills amounting to several hundreds of pounds. Murphy would later end up in hospital with cancer. Another temporary nanny, Christabel Martin, received strange phone calls to the house, which included heavy breathing and a strange man asking for people at the home that didn't exist, though the culprit was never determined. John began to struggle. The court case cost him £20,000 alone, and he began to drink and smoke heavily. His friends were extremely concerned, even more so when John, whilst drunk, discussed murdering his own wife to save himself from bankruptcy, claiming that he would dispose of the body in Solent, and he would never be caught. He even wanted to buy the children from Veronica, asking a bunch of people nearby to lend him as much money as possible, but this plan failed. His gambling was still going on and his debts were growing, up to around £50,000. But strangely, around late October 1974, John Lucan seemed to completely change for the better. His obsession over regaining his children had vanished. He had dinner with his mother and instead of his normal ranting about family problems, he would rather discuss politics. On November the 6th, he visited his uncle and seemed in good spirits. He then met with a friend, Charlotte Andrina Calhoun, who described him as very happy, and there was no indication that he was worried or depressed about anything.
On November the 6th, 1974, John played some backgammon with his friend George Weiss and Stephen Raphael. George later claimed that he will never forget the look on Lucan's face as he sat opposite him on the table that night, believing that he most certainly was planning his actions at that very moment. He claimed he wasn't his usual chirpy self and barely even spoke. He would only look up to order another drink. Whenever George asked him what was wrong, he claimed that it was nothing, but had absolutely no confidence in his voice whatsoever. However, once John went to the toilet, George had the opportunity to ask Stephen why he was acting this way. And he claimed that he was struggling with the separation from his wife, so he bought a kitten to cheer her and the children up. However, he claimed that after John dropped the kitten off at their house, it was returned back through his letterbox, with its throat cut. Many believing this was a trigger for things to come.
At this time, casinos were only open between 2 p.m. and 4 a.m, so John would often gamble into the early hours of the morning, which led to a bad case of insomnia. However, on November the 7th, he was up early and made several phone calls before he set a meal date with Charlotte, but he didn't turn up. Concerned, she drove past his home, the restaurant, and anywhere he was known for gambling, but him and his car were nowhere to be seen. John was also expected at a 1 p.m. lunch, but he also didn't appear. At 4 p.m, he called a chemist on Lower Belgrave Street near his wife's home and asked the pharmacist to identify a small capsule, which turned out to be Limbitrol 5, used to treat anxiety and depression. He had allegedly made similar visits like this in the past since splitting up with Veronica, but he never disclosed where he got the medication from. At 4:45, he called a friend and even met with him at 6:30. John had wanted his help on a gambling article he had been asked to write. He then drove his friend home at 8 p.m. in a different car, and at 8:30 called that same restaurant to check on a reservation for dinner with some friends. One of these friends had called him at 5:15 and invited him to the theatre, but John declined and instead asked to meet at the restaurant at 11. But John never turned up to this either, and didn't answer when they tried to reach his phone. Sandra Rivet was one of many nannies who had worked for John Lucan and his family. She would normally go out with her boyfriend on Thursday nights, but decided to change her night off on this particular occasion. She would last speak with him on this day at 8 p.m. She put the younger children to bed at around 8:55 before asking Veronica if she would like a cup of tea before heading down to the basement kitchen. Upon entering, Sandra was violently bludgeoned to death with a piece of bandaged lead pipe. The killer then placed her body into a canvas mailbag. Meanwhile, upstairs, Veronica wondered what was taking her nanny so long and decided to check on her, calling down the stairs before she was attacked by the same man. Veronica screamed for her life but was told to shut up, to which she claimed she instantly recognized her husband's voice. The fight continued as she bit his fingers. He threw her face down onto the carpet, but she managed to turn around and squeeze his testicles, which led to him releasing his grip on her throat and give in. She asked where her nanny was before John reluctantly confessed to killing her.
It's believed that he thought Sandra was his wife, as they were quite similar in height and weight, and he accidentally killed the wrong woman amidst the darkness.
Veronica promised to help him escape, but only if he remained in the house for a few days, allowing her injuries to heal. John then casually went upstairs and sent his daughter to bed before entering a bedroom. Veronica wanted to lie down, but John suggested using towels to prevent staining the bedding, even going to get some to supposedly clean her face for her. But upon John leaving the room, Veronica made a run for it and fled to a nearby pub.
Veronica later claimed that she did actually intend to protect him. She said that if he hadn't have attacked her, she would have allowed him to run away and she would have denied seeing him that night, as she still had feelings for him. She intended to still protect him, but she had to seek help for her own injuries, which is the only reason she reported the attack.
Sometime between 10 and 10:30 p.m, John arrived at the home of a parent of one of his children's friends, Madeleine Florman, in Chester Square. Florman ignored the door at first, before receiving a strange, incoherent phone call, to which she slammed the receiver down. Though she never directly interacted with John that night, bloodstains would later be discovered on her doorstep. Sometime between 10:30 and 11 p.m, John then called his mother and asked her to collect his children, speaking of a terrible catastrophe at his wife's home. He claimed that he was driving past when he saw Veronica fighting a man in the basement. He went to investigate and found his wife screaming. He then called his mother again at 12:30 and claimed that he would be in touch with her later that day, and even promised to call the police a few hours later. Upon this call, officers entered Veronica's home to discover the body, and she was taken to hospital. John then drove 42 miles to Uckfield in East Sussex to visit friends, and this was the last ever confirmed sighting of the 7th Earl of Lucan. An investigation began, but the police were baffled as there was no sign of forced entry into the home. Blood was found on a towel in Veronica's bedroom, as well as on the basement staircase, with a blood-stained lead pipe on the floor. 2 cups and saucers were also found in a pool of blood, and there was also blood on leaves in the back garden. John's own home was searched, but nothing involving the investigation was found, though it's worth noting that he did leave behind his wallet, car keys, money, and driving license. His car's engine was cold and its battery was flat. Despite being heavily sedated in hospital, Veronica quickly revealed her attacker. But John Lucan was nowhere to be seen, and he was listed in newspapers and television stations across the country as a wanted person for questioning. It was soon learned that he had visited friends after the murder, and they were then contacted, who revealed during his time with them he even wrote 2 letters to his brother-in-law, Bill Shand Kidd, which were later collected and were covered in blood. Dear Bill, the most ghastly circumstances arose tonight, which I briefly described to my mother. When I interrupted the fight at Lower Belgrave Street and the man left, Veronica accused me of having hired him. I took her upstairs and sent Frances to bed and tried to clean her up. She lay doggo for a bit, and when I was in the bathroom, left the house. The circumstantial evidence against me is strong in that V will say it was all my doing. I will also lie doggo for a bit, but I am only concerned for the children. If you can manage it, I want them to live with you. Coot St. Martin's Lane will handle school fees. V has demonstrated her hatred for me in the past and would do anything to see me accused. For George and Frances to go through life knowing their father had stood in the dock for attempted murder will be too much. When they are old enough to understand, explain to them the dream of paranoia and look after them. Yours ever, John. The friends were then questioned over the fact they didn't alert the authorities immediately upon John's arrival, but they claimed they hadn't seen the news or heard that he was wanted. During this time, John's children were taken to Guilsborough in Northamptonshire for a few weeks. Veronica would eventually leave the hospital and the children would return to her before relocating to Plymouth to hide from the constant interest of the press. The car that John had been using to drive across the country was actually found about 16 miles from Uckfield on November the 10th. In the boot of the car, there was a lead pipe covered in surgical tape, as well as a full bottle of vodka. Witnesses claim that it was parked there sometime between 5 and 8 a.m. on November the 8th, the morning after the murder. The owner of the car also received a letter from Lucan, but he had thrown the envelope away, so it's uncertain where it was sent from. My dear Michael, I've had a traumatic night of unbelievable coincidence. However, I won't bore you with anything or involve you, except to say that when you come across my children, which I hope you will, please tell them that you knew me and that all I cared about was them. The fact that a crooked solicitor and a rotten psychiatrist destroyed me between them will be of no importance to the children. I gave Bilshan Kidd an account of what actually happened, but judging by my last effort in court, no one, let alone a 67-year-old judge, would believe. And I no longer care except that my children should be protected. Yours ever, John. It was even considered that John had committed suicide, but a search was administered and nothing was found. Tracker dogs were used, but all that was discovered were the skeletal remains of a judge who had vanished some years earlier. Divers searched a nearby harbour and a search was even done with infrared photography, but there was nothing. A warrant for his arrest for the murder of Sandra Rivet and attempted murder of his wife was issued on November the 12th, 1974. Forensic examinations of both lead pipes from the house and the car soon began. The one inside the home had a mixture of Veronica and Sandra's blood, as well as Veronica's hair, but the pipe inside the car had nothing. It couldn't even be proven that they were both cut from the same longer piece of piping, though it was believed to have been likely. The tape from both seemed similar, but again it couldn't be proven. Though there was blood found inside the car belonging to both women, and Veronica's hair was found inside the vehicle as well. The fact that some friends met with John the day after and didn't immediately report it led to much speculation, which caused a search across the entire country to no avail. While others doubted Veronica's story, believing she was lying and accusing her husband to protect herself. And John's family also protested his absolute innocence. His fingerprints weren't found at the scene of the crime, and there was no forced entry. And also, this would mean Veronica's story is that John murdered a woman, attacked her, and then casually and calmly helped her get up to her bedroom. However, John claimed to have seen her fighting a man in the basement. This would have only been possible if he stooped low enough to the pavement.
In fact, the basement light bulb had been intentionally removed,
making it even harder to see.
Almost as if it was all completely planned.
Veronica claims she didn't even enter the basement despite John's claims, and her story is backed up with the forensic evidence of the blood, though some believe she may have contaminated the crime scene before leaving the property. Though, if John did in fact see another man fighting his wife inside the basement, the man in question couldn't have escaped as the room was locked and there were no signs of a forced escape and nobody ever saw any other person. Despite John's absence, he became bankrupt and his estate was sold off in March 1976 for around £30,000, though his family would pay off the debts in the years that followed.
Weirdly, in the early 1980s, the children wanted to live with their aunt and uncle instead, and Veronica agreed, believing it was best for them. But even more bizarrely, not long after, she completely cut ties with them. They wouldn't speak for around 35 years. The reason for this separation has never been made to the public.
But due to his disappearance, no death certificate was issued, and therefore his son, George Lloyd Bingham, was unable to take his father's title. It wasn't until 2013, 39 years after he went missing, when they were finally able to have him declared dead, and George finally became the 8th Earl of Lucan. Most believe that John Lucan was a murderer who ran away to escape his own guilt, possibly even killing himself in the English Channel, weighing himself down with a rock. Veronica believed that her husband did this because he was just that noble.
Veronica always found the stories of John remaining alive completely ridiculous. She believed that he had committed suicide, claiming he jumped off a ferry in the middle of the English Channel. John was an avid powerboat racer and he knew specific details of the propellers. Veronica believed that he would have known exactly when to jump in order for the propellers to kill him and to destroy any remains.
She always dismissed the theory that her husband was still alive, claiming that he would just never be able to cope with living abroad.
Though his son George believed that his father took some sleeping pills, got drunk on a boat, and then sank to the bottom of the English Channel.
Though others felt like suicide was the furthest thing on John's mind. One theory is that he even moved to South Africa. It's believed that he was smuggled out of the country by some underground financiers, and then maybe even considered too great a risk, so they murdered him in Switzerland.
There were countless theories that John escaped to Africa, India, Australia, Holland, or even that he was living in a Land Rover in New Zealand. John Aspinall was a zookeeper and casino owner who would often meet with Lucan at said casino a few times. He claimed that Lucan was in Africa in the early 80s, and his children were even flown there to see him at least twice, though they denied this claim. It was believed that Aspinall was the one who assisted him in escaping the country. Although he denied this, he did confess that if Lucan did ask for his help, he would have done so without a second thought. But Aspinall had a close friend and personal assistant, Jill Findlay, who claims that she had actually arranged travel accommodation for Lucan's children to go to Kenya and then Gabon for their father to see them, though it was clear that John didn't intend on approaching his children, in fear they would return home and alert their mother. Jill never told the police this because she didn't assist in John's escape from the country, but she also didn't truly understand the severity of her actions at the time. She just saw it as a way of letting a father see his children again. Findlay didn't reveal this information for over 30 years. It wasn't until 2012 when she was suffering health problems and wanted to reveal everything before she died. The only people who could confirm this story, however, John Aspinall and Jimmy Goldsmith, another associate of Lucan's, are now dead, and it's uncertain whether Findlay's story is genuine or not. Veronica, however, dismissed this claim, stating that the children would have needed her permission to travel abroad, and she just called the story ridiculous. Though others claim this to be true and that John actually passed away in Africa in 2000. Another bizarre theory is that John Aspinall's zoo was where his body was disposed. Some claim that John Lucan shot himself and was then fed to a tiger in Howlett Zoo.
There have been many possible sightings over the years, the first almost instantly, though it turned out to be British politician John Stonehouse, who attempted to fake his own death. One sighting was in France the next year, but this led nowhere. Another was in Colombia, but that turned out to be an American businessman. John Miller was a bounty hunter who had kidnapped fugitive train robber Ronnie Biggs, and he claimed that he had actually kidnapped John Lucan in 1982, 8 years after he was last seen, though this was later proven to have been a big hoax.
Though John's brother Hugh, who passed away a few years ago at the age of 78, always believed that he was still alive somewhere in Africa. Hugh himself had even moved there, leading many to believe that he was secretly meeting with his brother this entire time. After all, Hugh always claimed that he believed John wasn't guilty of the murder. He had written an autobiography suggesting possible theories of his brother's outcome, but journalists noticed that he would always hint at evidence of him still being alive, but would always stop himself just short of giving having solid evidence. He always insisted on his brother's innocence but never disclosed any further details, though it's widely believed that he most likely did have some contact with him. Neil Berryman was a man who was told quite early on that he was adopted by his mother and father, Audrey and Ivan, but he always felt no desire to discover who his biological parents were. But in 2003, Audrey fell ill and decided it was now time to inform him where he came from. Neil claimed that he was going to search for his biological parents, but only after his adopted parents passed away, as he would never want to upset them. But Audrey was insistent, giving him an envelope. However, he still refused to open it. Unfortunately, Audrey passed away a year later. It took 4 years for Neil to finally open the envelope, as his father was still alive, though he was very tempted to just throw it on the fireplace. But at the very last minute, he changed his mind and opened the envelope to discover that he was the biological son of Sandra Rivet. Audrey had also attached newspaper clippings about the murder. Neil confronted his adopted father, but he claimed that he and Audrey only ever discussed it once, and it was never brought up again. Sandra had been having an affair with a married man and fell pregnant with Neil, giving him up for adoption when he was just 6 months old. Neil struggled with the revelation, quickly going on medication, but he admitted he didn't blame her for giving him up. But he believed that John was still alive, and he ended up spending £30,000 of his own money to try to find him, to bring him to justice for murdering his mother. Neil claims that he actually tracked John down, still alive, in Australia, though in poor health condition, and he is outraged that the police won't even investigate the man, demanding justice before it's too late. He claims that the man is housebound and was awaiting a serious operation at one point, but this was never followed up on.
In 2003, a former Scotland Yard detective believed that he had actually found the man in Goa, India, but it turned out to be folk singer Barry Halpin. In 2007, some New Zealand reporters interviewed a homeless British expatriate who people believed was actually John Lucan.
Veronica remained estranged from her family for 35 years, living isolated and alone, though despite her ex-husband's actions, she still kept a portrait of him in her house. Her children barely kept in touch. She wasn't even aware that one of her daughters was getting married and never met any of her grandchildren. Unfortunately, it all became too much when, in 2017, Veronica committed suicide through an overdose, dying alone in her home, having never resolved the dispute with her children. And to make matters even worse, she had cut them out of her will entirely and left them with nothing, instead donating all of her worth to a homeless charity, a decision that her son George actually applauded.
So was John Lucan a murderer who killed the wrong woman and then attacked his own wife? Or was he just a victim of a massive coincidence with him simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time? Did he run away out of guilt, or was it truly to remain safe from the accusations? And regardless, where did he go after that? Did he commit suicide, or was he killed? Did he move away and continue to live a quiet life? Or is he somehow still alive out there somewhere? At the age of 86. There's so many twists and turns to this story, so many questions, and after all this time we are still seeking answers.